What would you do if the company you built with your own hands, your legacy, turned you away at the door, treating you like an outsider? That's exactly what happened to this undercover CEO, and what he uncovered on the inside will leave you speechless. From ruthless managers to heartbreaking employee struggles, the truth about his own business was far worse than he ever imagined. But when he finally reveals who he really is, no one sees it coming. Stay tuned, because what happens next will change everything. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you speechless. The air outside the massive glass building felt colder than usual, even though the sun shone brightly overhead. James Foster adjusted the strap of his worn duffel bag on his shoulder, the weight of it a stark contrast to the lightness of the sleek life he used to lead. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes tracing the name of the company emblazoned on the sign above the revolving doors. Foster Enterprises. His name, his legacy. Yet today, he was no more than a stranger to the very empire he had built. He stepped forward with determination, the gravel crunching under his scuffed boots. James had spent the last 2 weeks planning this, mentally preparing himself to blend in with the people who worked tirelessly under his roof. He approached the reception desk, his shoulders slumped, his posture deliberately humble. The receptionist, a young woman with sharp eyes and a headset perched over perfectly styled hair, barely glanced up from her computer screen. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone detached as though she'd already decided he didn't belong. "Yes," James said, his voice rougher than usual, rehearsed to sound unsure of itself. "I'm looking for a job. Heard there might be some openings here." The woman's lips curled into a faint smirk. Her fingers clacked against the keyboard, but she didn't look back at him. "We don't take walk-ins. Applications are online only. Try the website." James felt his pulse quicken, his chest tightening with an indignation he hadn't anticipated. He had expected to slip through unnoticed, but being denied entry outright? It was a bitter pill to swallow. For years he had signed off on policies meant to improve efficiency and streamline processes. Now, he was staring into the face of one of those processes, cold and impersonal, shutting him out. "Are you sure?" he pressed, forcing a tentative smile. "I just thought I'd try my luck in person." The receptionist's expression hardened. "I said no walk-ins. There's nothing I can do. Please move along." James stared at her, tempted to say something, anything, that would remind her who he was. But he swallowed the words. This was the point, wasn't it? To see what it felt like on the other side of the desk, to feel what his employees and customers felt when they encountered the barriers his company had built. "All right," he murmured, lowering his gaze as he turned toward the exit. He could feel her eyes on him as he walked away, the heat of her judgment burning into his back. Outside, the city buzzed around him. Cars honked in the distance, and the scent of street food wafted through the air. James exhaled sharply, gripping the strap of his bag tighter. He could have walked into that building as himself. Suits would have been pressed, smiles plastered on every face, his every word treated like gospel. But that wasn't what he needed. He needed the truth, even if it stung. Especially if it stung. He found a bench nearby and sank into it, pulling out his phone. As he scrolled through the anonymous profiles of the company's lower-level job listings, he couldn't help but notice how sterile the descriptions were. Words like streamlined workflow and team-focused environment leapt off the screen, but he wondered how much of it was real. He tapped on a warehouse assistant job and clicked apply. James leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he stared up at the towering building he had once called his pride and joy. Somewhere inside, decisions were being made, numbers were being crunched, and faces like the one he had just seen were going about their work, blissfully unaware of the man sitting on a bench outside. He had built this place with his own 2 hands. Every corner of that building, every product shipped, had his name stamped on it. But now, he felt like an outsider, disconnected from the very thing that had once driven him. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was an automated reply from the company. "Thank you for your application. You are scheduled for an orientation session tomorrow at 9 a.m. James tucked the phone back into his pocket. A mixture of relief and apprehension settling over him. Tomorrow, he would walk into that building again. Not as James Foster, CEO, but as James Foster, temporary warehouse assistant. It was a role he had never imagined himself in, but it was one he knew he had to embrace. He stood up, the weight of his task sinking in. This wasn't just about proving a point or fixing a few cracks in the system. This was about seeing the truth, about himself, his company, and the people who kept it alive. And the truth, James suspected, was going to be far more uncomfortable than he was ready for. As he walked away, the glass building loomed behind him, its reflective surface gleaming in the afternoon sun. For the first time in years, James felt uncertain about what lay ahead. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to turn back. The next morning, James stood outside the warehouse entrance, blending into the growing crowd of employees, arriving for the start of their shifts. The scene felt alien to him. People shuffled in with weary faces, their conversations muted, the occasional yawn punctuating the low hum of morning chatter. James adjusted the plain baseball cap on his head and checked his watch. It was 8:45 a.m. The warehouse itself was a far cry from the polished offices he was used to. The gray concrete building stretched endlessly in both directions, the air outside thick with the scent of diesel from the trucks rumbling in and out of the loading bays. James clutched his printed orientation confirmation in his hand and followed a small group toward a side entrance marked "Staff Only." Inside, the world came alive with motion. Forklifts beeped as they maneuvered around stacks of pallets, conveyor belts hummed under fluorescent lights, and the distant shouts of supervisors echoed through the cavernous space. James paused for a moment, taking it all in. This was where the heart of his company beat, where goods were sorted, packed, and shipped. And yet, he had never truly experienced it. "Orientation's in the break room," a voice called out, snapping James out of his thoughts. A wiry man in a neon safety vest stood nearby, gesturing toward a door down a long hallway. James nodded and followed the others, heading in that direction. The break room was cramped and stark, with scuffed linoleum floors and rows of mismatched chairs. A handful of people were already seated, most of them looking as nervous as James felt. A young woman with dark circles under her eyes tapped anxiously at her phone, while a man with salt and pepper hair quietly sipped coffee from a battered thermos. James chose a seat near the back, keeping his head low as he observed the room. A few minutes later, the door swung open, and a woman in her early 40s strode in, clipboard in hand. She wore a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, her pressed uniform a stark contrast to the casual attire of the workers. James recognized her almost immediately. Karen Walsh, the warehouse manager. "All right, everyone," Karen said, her voice sharp and no nonsense. "Welcome to Foster Enterprises Warehouse number 12. I'm Karen, and I run things here. Orientation will take about an hour. Pay attention because we don't have time to repeat ourselves." James studied her closely as she spoke. Her tone was brisk, almost impatient, and she seemed to wield her authority like a weapon. It wasn't overtly hostile, but there was an edge to her words that put everyone on guard. Karen launched into a rundown of safety protocols, job expectations, and shift schedules, her eyes darting from one face to the next, as if daring anyone to ask a question. "We operate on efficiency here," she said, her voice rising slightly. "If you can't keep up, you won't last long. We don't have room for slackers." James felt a flicker of unease. He had written many of the policies she was outlining, but hearing them delivered this way, stripped of nuance and empathy, made them feel cold, even harsh. When Karen finally finished, she handed out paperwork and told the group to sign the forms and return them by the end of the day. "Once that's done, you'll be assigned your supervisors. Dismissed." She didn't wait for a response, turning on her heel and leaving the room. As the group began to disperse, James stayed seated, watching the others. A few people exchanged quiet murmurs, but most left quickly, their eyes downcast. He couldn't help but notice how tense everyone seemed, as if they were already bracing for the worst. James stood, and made his way to the door, only to stop when he overheard a conversation nearby. "She's a hard ass," a young man muttered to the woman next to him, jerking his head toward where Karen had exited. The woman shrugged. "What do you expect? They're all like that. It's just about numbers to them. If you don't hit your targets, you're out." James clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to say something. He slipped out of the room and into the hallway, his thoughts racing. These weren't just policies. These were people's lives. And something was clearly wrong here. He made his way to the warehouse floor, where his first shift was about to begin. As he stepped into the chaotic swirl of activity, a supervisor handed him a clipboard and directed him toward a section of shelving stacked with boxes. "Unload these, organize by SKU, and get them ready for packing. You've got 2 hours." James nodded and got to work, his hands fumbling slightly as he lifted the first box. The weight of it surprised him, and he quickly realized how physically demanding this job would be. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he tried to keep up with the others around him, who moved with practiced efficiency. He stole glances at his coworkers, noting their weary expressions and the quiet urgency in their movements. No one seemed to be enjoying themselves, but no one complained either. It was as if they had all accepted this as the way things were. By the end of the shift, James's arms ached and his back throbbed. He collapsed onto a bench in the break room, exhausted but more determined than ever. He had gotten a glimpse of life at the bottom of the ladder, and it was nothing like he had imagined. As he sipped from a bottle of water, James overheard snippets of conversation from a nearby table. 2 workers were discussing a recent change in quotas, their voices low but tinged with frustration. "They don't care if we're breaking our backs," one of them said bitterly, "as long as they get their numbers." James's stomach churned. This was just the beginning, but already the cracks in his company's foundation were glaringly obvious. Tomorrow, he thought, gripping the bottle tightly. Tomorrow, he would dig deeper. The next morning, James arrived early, his muscles still sore from the previous day. The warehouse was already alive with activity, the hum of machinery and the clatter of boxes creating a steady rhythm. He tucked his cap lower over his face, blending into the sea of workers. Today, he was determined to observe more than just the workflow. He needed to understand the people who made the company tick, their struggles, their frustrations, and the silent weight they carried. As he stacked boxes in the shipping section, James noticed a young woman nearby struggling to lift a particularly heavy package. Her face flushed red as she strained, her movements hesitant. James set down his own load and stepped over to help. "Here, let me get that," he said, gripping the box and hoisting it onto the conveyor belt. The woman looked up, startled. "Thanks," she mumbled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her name tag read Mia Torres. "No problem," James replied, offering a faint smile. He noticed the faint shadows under her eyes, the kind that came from sleepless nights and relentless stress. "This your first week here?" "Second," Mia said, her voice edged with fatigue. "Feels like it's been a month, though." James chuckled lightly, though he felt a pang of guilt. He had no idea how exhausting these roles were until now. "What were you doing before this?" "Retail," she said, hefting another box onto the conveyor belt. "But the hours here are better, or they're supposed to be anyway. I've got 2 kids, so I needed something that worked around their schedules." James nodded, his throat tightening. Mia's tone was matter-of-fact, but there was a quiet weariness beneath it. "How old are your kids?" 6 and 9, she said, her face softening for a moment. "They're great. Keep me going, you know, but this job, it's not exactly what I thought it'd be. They keep adding quotas, and half the time the equipment doesn't even work right. Karen says we just need to find solutions." She shook her head, bitterness creeping into her voice. James frowned. "That doesn't sound fair," Mia shrugged. "It's not about fair. It's about hitting numbers. That's all they care about." Their conversation was cut short when a supervisor barked an order from across the room, and Mia quickly turned back to her station. James watched her for a moment before returning to his own work. He had seen the numbers on reports, productivity rates, efficiency metrics, turnover percentages, but none of it had prepared him for the reality of what those numbers represented. Exhausted people trying to make ends meet. Later that afternoon, during a brief break, James found himself sitting with Tom, the older worker he had noticed the day before. Tom was quiet, his hands rough and calloused, his movements deliberate. He had the air of someone who had seen it all and learned to live with it. "First week, huh?" Tom said, glancing at James as he sipped from a steaming thermos. "Yeah," James replied, taking a sip of water. "Still getting the hang of things." Tom smirked faintly. "You'll learn quick or you won't last. That's how it works around here." James leaned forward, lowering his voice. "How long have you been here?" "Too long," Tom said with a dry chuckle. "Started back when this place was still run by the Foster family, before they went corporate." He shook his head. "Things were different back then. They cared about the people who worked here. Now, we're just cogs in the machine." James felt a pang of shame. He had built this company to be better than that, but somewhere along the way he had lost sight of what mattered. "What changed?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Tom shrugged. "Profit margins, I guess. They keep cutting corners. Less staff, more quotas, cheaper materials, and don't get me started on the managers. Karen's the worst of them. All she cares about is making her numbers look good so she can climb the ladder. She doesn't give a damn about us." James's jaw tightened. He wanted to defend himself, to say this wasn't what he had intended, but he stayed silent. This wasn't the time to reveal who he was. As their break ended, Tom clapped James on the shoulder. "Word of advice," he said. "Keep your head down and don't ask too many questions. They'll notice if you do, and not in a good way." James nodded, but inwardly, he knew he couldn't follow that advice. He had seen enough to know that something was deeply wrong, and he wasn't going to let it slide. That evening, as James left the warehouse, he noticed Karen standing near the exit, clipboard in hand. She was berating a young man who had apparently fallen behind on his tasks. "This isn't a charity," Karen snapped, her voice cutting through the air. "If you can't keep up, don't bother coming back tomorrow." The young man stammered an apology, his face pale and anxious. Karen waved him off dismissively and turned away, her expression cold and unyielding. James watched the scene from a distance, his hands clenching into fists. He had heard enough stories, seen enough to know that this wasn't an isolated incident. Karen's harshness was emblematic of a deeper problem, one that stretched far beyond her. As he walked to his car, James felt a simmering anger begin to take root. This wasn't just about quotas or efficiency. This was about people, real people with families, dreams, and struggles. And somewhere along the way, his company had forgotten that. He couldn't change everything overnight, but he could start, and tomorrow he would dig even deeper. The following day, James arrived at the warehouse with a renewed sense of determination. The soreness in his muscles lingered, but it had dulled to a background ache, one he barely noticed now. As he passed through the staff entrance, he caught sight of Karen near the break room, speaking to a group of supervisors. Her expression was sharp, her words clipped, though James couldn't make out what she was saying. Whatever it was, it left the group looking tense as they dispersed to their respective sections. James had a plan today: to observe more closely, to ask subtle questions, and to quietly piece together the full extent of the problems here. He wasn't just another worker anymore. He was a man on a mission, and every conversation, every detail mattered. By mid-morning he was assigned to a packing station alongside Mia. The two worked in silence at first, their hands moving in a steady rhythm as they taped boxes and loaded them onto the conveyor belt. Eventually, Mia broke the quiet. "You're keeping up better today," she said with a faint smile. James smirked. "I'm getting the hang of it, but I don't know how you've been doing this for 2 weeks. My back's already threatening to quit." Mia laughed softly, though there was little humor in it. "You get used to it. Or you don't. Most people don't stick around long enough to find out." James hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Is it really that bad here?" Mia paused, glancing over her shoulder to ensure no one was listening. "It's not just the work," she said quietly. It's the way they treat you. Karen's always breathing down your neck, and if you mess up even once, she'll make your life hell. People here don't complain because they're scared. You can't afford to lose a job like this, even if it's awful." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. James nodded, pretending to focus on the box in front of him. Inside, his frustration grew. These weren't isolated grievances. They were systemic failures. The kind he had always assured himself didn't exist in his company. But they did. Later, during the lunch break, James sat with Tom again. The older man had a way of speaking that was blunt but honest, and James found himself drawn to his quiet wisdom. "Did you hear about the guy Karen chewed out yesterday?" James asked, keeping his tone casual. Tom snorted. "Which one?" "She's got a new victim every day." "The younger guy," James said. "Dark hair, looked like he'd just started." Tom's expression darkened. "Oh, him. Yeah, that was Dylan. Poor kid. He's been here less than a month and she's already riding him hard. Heard he went home early last night, probably won't come back." "Is that common?" James asked. "Common enough," Tom replied grimly. "Karen's got a reputation. She doesn't care who she steps on as long as her numbers look good. People burn out fast around here. If it's not her, it's the quotas. They keep raising them, and the equipment's always breaking down. But management doesn't care. They just want the numbers." James stared at the table, his mind racing. He had seen this happen in other industries, read about it in reports and studies, but he had never imagined it could happen in his own company. Yet here it was, playing out right in front of him. Before their break ended, James decided to push a little further. "What about Karen's bosses? Do they know what's going on?" Tom scoffed. "Of course they do. They just don't care. As long as she delivers results, they'll look the other way. That's how it works. The people at the top never see what's really going on down here." James swallowed hard, the weight of Tom's words settling over him. He couldn't argue with the man, not without revealing who he really was. And deep down he knew Tom was right. He hadn't seen what was really going on, because he hadn't looked. As the afternoon wore on, James began noticing more details that he had previously overlooked. The flickering lights in one section of the warehouse, the outdated conveyor belts that jammed every few minutes, the strained expressions on workers' faces as they tried to meet impossible quotas. It was all so clear now, the cracks in the foundation of his company laid bare. Toward the end of the day, James overheard Karen in a heated conversation with one of the supervisors. She stood near the loading dock, her voice sharp and unforgiving. "I don't care if the equipment's down," she snapped. "Figure it out. We're already behind schedule, and if those numbers don't improve, it's your head on the line, not mine." The supervisor nodded quickly, his shoulders hunched as he scurried away. Karen turned and caught James watching her. For a brief moment their eyes met, and James quickly looked away, pretending to focus on the box in front of him. As Karen walked past, he could feel the weight of her scrutiny. "You've got one more shift to prove you can keep up," she said coldly. "Don't make me regret hiring you." James nodded, keeping his expression neutral, but inside, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: righteous anger. Karen wasn't just a bad manager. She was the product of a culture he had unwittingly allowed to fester. As he left the warehouse that evening, James's thoughts were heavy. He had seen enough to know that the problems here weren't just surface level. They were deep, systemic, and entrenched. Fixing them would take more than just good intentions. It would take real action. He paused at the edge of the parking lot, looking back at the warehouse as the last rays of sunlight glinted off its metal walls. Tomorrow, he thought, would be different. Tomorrow he would start pulling at the threads to unravel the truth, and he would do whatever it took to set things right. The next morning James arrived early, determined to dig deeper into the dysfunction he had observed. The warehouse was quieter than usual as the early shift began trickling in, their faces still lined with the exhaustion of yesterday. James kept his head low and moved quickly to his station, ready to start his shift. Today, he had resolved to watch Karen more closely. She was clearly central to many of the issues he'd seen. her obsession with numbers, her ruthless treatment of employees. But James suspected there was more to her story. As much as he disliked her methods, he couldn't ignore the possibility that she was a symptom of a larger problem rather than the cause. Mid-morning, as James worked on sorting a fresh shipment, Karen's voice rang out across the warehouse floor. She was berating a forklift operator whose machine had broken down. The operator, a man in his late 30s named Luis, looked pale as Karen tore into him. "I don't care why it's broken," Karen snapped, her arms crossed tightly. "We're already behind. Find another way or I'll find someone who can." Luis tried to explain, his voice shaky. "I've been reporting this for weeks. Maintenance hasn't—" "Excuses," Karen cut him off. "Just get it done, now." James watched as Luis nodded meekly and walked away. His shoulders slumped. Karen turned on her heel and marched toward her office, clipboard in hand. James saw his chance. During the next break, he approached Luis, who was sitting alone on a bench, staring at the floor. "Hey," James said, sitting beside him. "Rough morning?" Luis looked up, his eyes dull with frustration. "You could say that. Sounds like that forklift's been a problem for a while," James said casually. Luis let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, like months. I've reported it so many times I've lost count. They don't care. They just keep pushing us harder, even when the tools we need don't work." James frowned. "What happens if it doesn't get fixed?" Luis shrugged. "We improvise, or we fall behind and get chewed out for it. It's a lose-lose." He glanced at James, his expression skeptical. "Why do you care, anyway?" James hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I guess I'm just trying to figure out how things work around here. Doesn't seem like it's easy for anyone." Luis snorted. "That's putting it lightly." He stood, brushing off his hands. "Good luck, man. You'll need it." James watched him go, his jaw tightening. The more he listened, the more it became clear that the issues here weren't just the result of one bad manager. They were systemic, the product of a culture that prioritized numbers over people, efficiency over humanity. Later that day, James noticed something strange. Karen was standing near the shipping office, talking in hushed tones with a man in a suit, someone James hadn't seen before. The man's demeanor was polished but impatient, his arms crossed as he listened to Karen. James couldn't make out their words, but the tension in their body language was obvious. The man handed Karen a folder, and her expression darkened as she glanced through its contents. She nodded curtly, then stormed off toward her office, slamming the door behind her. The suited man lingered for a moment before walking briskly toward the exit. James's curiosity burned. Who was that man? And what was in the folder? Something about the interaction felt off, like there was more happening beneath the surface than Karen wanted anyone to see. That evening, as the warehouse began to wind down, James decided to linger. He pretended to finish his tasks slowly, watching as Karen left her office and locked the door behind her. When the floor was finally empty, he walked over to her office window and peered inside. The desk was cluttered with papers, but one document caught his eye, a list of employee names with notes beside each one. Some had simple comments like average or reliable, but others were marked with harsher labels: problematic, underperformer, consider termination. James's stomach churned. These weren't just evaluations, they were judgments, cold and clinical, reducing human beings to numbers and labels. And Karen wasn't just following orders, she was actively participating in a system that dehumanized her employees. As he walked back to his car, James felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. The interaction with the suited man, the notes in Karen's office, the broken systems and burned-out employees. It all pointed to a deeper rot within the company. But something else nagged at him, a question he couldn't shake. How much of this was Karen's fault? And how much of it was his? After all, he had created this company, built it with his own hands. He had written the policies, approved the strategies, trusted his executives to execute his vision. Now, he was seeing the consequences of those decisions up close. And they weren't just disappointing, they were devastating. Tomorrow, he thought as he started his car, he would push harder. He would get to the bottom of this no matter what it took, Because if this was the legacy of Foster Enterprises, it wasn't one he could live with. The next morning, James arrived at the warehouse earlier than usual, his resolve hardening with each passing day. He knew now that the issues weren't isolated incidents or the result of one bad manager. They were deeply ingrained in the company's culture. But he also knew that understanding the problem wasn't enough. He needed to act. And to act, he needed to dig even deeper. As the warehouse floor came to life, James began his shift alongside Mia. Her face looked more exhausted than before, her movements sluggish. He decided to probe carefully, keeping their conversation casual. "Tough morning?" he asked as they loaded boxes onto the conveyor belt. Mia nodded, stifling a yawn. "Yeah, my son was up sick last night, and my babysitter bailed on me this morning. Had to call my neighbor at the last minute. It's just one thing after another." James hesitated, then asked, "Have you ever thought about talking to HR? Maybe they could make things a little easier for you." Mia let out a bitter laugh. "HR? They don't care about people like me. I'm just a number to them. Karen's made that pretty clear. The last time someone tried to complain about the quotas, they got written up for insubordination. I'm not taking that risk." James felt his stomach twist. He had always believed his company cared about its employees, but the reality was far bleaker. As Mia's words sank in, James began to notice something he hadn't before. There was an air of quiet resignation among the workers, a shared understanding that speaking up would only make things worse. As the day went on, James kept an eye on Karen. She moved through the warehouse like a general inspecting her troops, her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand. She stopped frequently, barking orders at supervisors and workers alike. But James noticed something different about her today. She seemed distracted, her movements sharper, her tone more clipped than usual. Whatever was in that folder from the day before, it was clearly weighing on her. By midday, James decided to take a risk. He had seen enough to know that Karen wasn't the only problem, but she was a key piece of the puzzle. If he could understand her motivations, he might be able to unravel the larger issues. During a brief lull, James approached Karen as she stood near the loading dock, reviewing paperwork. She glanced up as he neared, her eyes narrowing. "What do you need?" she asked curtly. "I just wanted to ask about the quotas," James said, keeping his tone neutral. "It seems like they've been getting higher lately. Is that coming from corporate?" Karen's jaw tightened, and for a moment James thought she might snap at him, but then she sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "Look," she said, her voice lower than usual. "I don't set the quotas. That comes from above. I'm just doing my job, same as you." James tilted his head, sensing an opportunity. "It doesn't seem fair, though. People are struggling to keep up. Luis told me about the forklift issue, and it sounds like—" Karen cut him off, her eyes flashing. "Luis shouldn't be complaining to you, or to anyone. If I could get the maintenance budget approved, I'd fix the damn forklifts, but I can't. You think I like this? You think I enjoy pushing people like this?" James blinked, caught off guard by the sudden emotion in her voice. Karen shook her head, looking away. "You don't get it," she said, her tone quieter now. "If my numbers don't look good, I'm out. And if I'm out, someone else comes in and does the same thing, or worse. That's how it works. So no, it's not fair, but it's the system we're in." James felt a pang of guilt. For all her faults, Karen was trapped too, forced to enforce policies she didn't agree with, pressured by a system that valued results over people. He wanted to tell her the truth, to admit who he was, and promise her that change was coming, but he couldn't. Not yet. As the day wore on, James couldn't shake the weight of Karen's words. They echoed in his mind as he worked, filling him with a growing sense of urgency. He realized now that the problems went far beyond the warehouse. They were rooted in the very structure of the company he had built, and the only way to fix them was to confront them head-on. That evening, after most of the workers had gone home, James lingered near the office area. He waited until the warehouse was nearly empty, then made his way to Karen's office. The door was locked as he had expected, but the window gave him a clear view of her desk. He scanned the room quickly, his eyes landing on the folder she had received the day before. It was still there, lying on the corner of her desk. James's pulse quickened as he considered his options. Breaking into the office was out of the question, but he couldn't ignore the possibility that the folder held crucial information. He made a mental note of its location and decided to bide his time. As he walked back to his car, James's mind churned with questions. Who was the man in the suit? What was in the folder? And how deep did the problems in his company go? He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about fixing policies or replacing managers. It was about rebuilding an entire culture, one that had lost sight of the people it was supposed to serve. And if James wanted to make things right, he would need to take drastic action, starting with the truth. The next morning, James walked into the warehouse with a sense of clarity and purpose he hadn't felt in years. He had spent the night piecing together everything he'd seen, every conversation he'd overheard, every crack in the foundation of his company. Today wasn't just another day of observing. Today was the day he started pulling at the threads to uncover the full extent of the rot. The first step was the folder in Karen's office. He had seen enough to know it was important, and now he needed to find a way to access it. During the morning break, James approached Mia, who was seated in the break room nursing a cup of coffee. "Hey, Mia," he said, sitting across from her. "You've been here longer than me. Do you know if Karen ever leaves her office unlocked?" Mia frowned, setting down her cup. "Why are you asking about Karen?" James hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I overheard her arguing with someone the other day. I think there's something going on that could explain a lot of what's been happening around here. If we could find out more, maybe we could do something about it." Mia's eyes narrowed, her expression skeptical. "Do something? Like what?" "Like take it to someone who can fix it," James said, his tone firm. "Look, I know it's risky, but don't you think it's worth it, for all of us?" Mia studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Karen usually leaves her office to do the afternoon check-in with the supervisors. She's gone for about 15 minutes. But whatever you're thinking, you better be quick. If she catches you—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the warning in her tone was clear. James nodded. "Thanks, Mia. I'll be careful." Later that afternoon, James kept a close eye on Karen. Sure enough, shortly after lunch, she left her office and began making her rounds. James waited until she disappeared into one of the storage aisles before slipping toward her office. The door was locked, as he had expected, but the window provided a clear view of the inside. James pulled a paperclip from his pocket, straightening it with practiced ease. It wasn't the first time he'd had to improvise under pressure, and he wasn't above bending the rules if it meant uncovering the truth. Within moments, the lock clicked open, and James slipped inside, closing the door behind him. The folder was exactly where he had seen it, lying on the corner of Karen's desk. He opened it quickly, his eyes scanning the pages. What he found made his stomach drop. Inside were detailed reports on the warehouse's performance, but they weren't the sanitized versions he had seen in board meetings. These were raw, unfiltered documents, records of safety violations, equipment failures, employee complaints, and escalating turnover rates. There were also emails from corporate executives, pressuring Karen to maximize efficiency and cut costs at all levels, with little regard for the human toll. One email in particular caught James's attention. It was from an executive named Mark Reynolds, someone James had worked closely with in the past. The email outlined plans to implement even stricter quotas, reduce staffing levels, and deny requests for maintenance budgets, all in the name of boosting short-term profits. James's hands shook as he read the words. This wasn't just Karen's doing. She was a cog in a much larger machine, one that he had unknowingly helped create. Before he could process what he was feeling, he heard footsteps approaching. Panic surged through him as he quickly returned the folder to its original spot and locked the door behind him. He slipped away just as Karen rounded the corner, her clipboard in hand, none the wiser. For the rest of the day, James worked in a haze, the weight of what he had discovered pressing down on him. The reports, the emails, the cold indifference to the workers' struggles, it all painted a grim picture of a company that had lost its way. That evening, as he sat in his car outside the warehouse, James made a decision. He couldn't stay silent any longer. Tomorrow, he would reveal who he was, confront Karen, and take the evidence to the executives at corporate headquarters. But he wouldn't stop there. He would meet with the workers, hear their stories, and make it clear that things were going to change, because if Foster Enterprises was going to survive, it would have to become the company he had always envisioned, a company that valued its people as much as its profits. As the sun set over the city, James leaned back in his seat, his resolve hardening. Tomorrow would be the start of something new. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but it would be worth it. For the first time in a long time, James felt like he was doing what he was meant to do, and he wasn't going to stop until he made it right. The following day, James Foster stood in front of the gathered employees in the break room, no longer wearing his disguise. The room was filled with confusion, surprise, and even a hint of resentment as workers realized who he was. James took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm James Foster," he began, "and I built this company, but I've realized that somewhere along the way, I failed you. I failed this company. I let numbers, policies, and profits overshadow the people who make this place run. And for that, I'm truly sorry." A heavy silence fell over the room as James continued. He shared what he had seen in his time undercover, the grueling shifts, the impossible quotas, the broken equipment. He spoke of Mia's struggles as a single mother, Tom's exhaustion after years of dedication, and Luis's frustration with being unheard. As he spoke, faces softened, the walls of mistrust beginning to crack. "I didn't come here to lecture you or to excuse what's happened," James said, his voice breaking slightly. "I came here to understand, and now that I do, I promise you this. Things will change. It won't happen overnight, but we will rebuild this company together, with integrity, respect, and compassion." As the workers looked on, James felt a mix of emotions, shame for his past failures, but also hope for the future. He knew there would be resistance, that some wouldn't trust him right away, but he was prepared to earn their trust, one step at a time. That day, James left the warehouse with a new purpose. His lesson was clear. A company is not its buildings, policies, or profits. It's the people, and they deserve to be seen, valued, and heard.